Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tizengauzen. Today, October 15th, there are a lot of interesting news stories. In this episode, personal threats to Donald Trump are coming from Russia. Tomahawks haven't even been given to Ukraine yet, but they've already become the main nightmare for Russians. Russian propagandists are already losing their minds over them. Assad is facing big problems in Moscow. And the new president of Syria is heading to Putin and will demand that Assad be handed over to him personally. NATO is deciding how to shoot down Russian planes, and meanwhile Ufa and Volgograd in Russia are burning. Ukrainian drones have sent a fiery greeting. And in Russia, they are planning to raise taxes even further, and IT specialists are getting ready to flee the country. And in Europe, a plan has been presented for readiness for war with Russia in 2030. We'll talk about this and more. There's a lot of interesting stuff in today's episode, so subscribe if you're new to this channel. So, right now in Russia, the most popular word in all the news and talk shows is Tomahawk. Against the backdrop of Zelensky's visit to the US and the possible delivery of Tomahawk missiles, there has been a real hysteria on television and among Russian politicians. I'll quote the words of one of the Kremlin's main propagandists, Solovyov. The very fact of supplying Tomahawks should be grounds for using special munitions, and at the moment of launch the response should be not only against Ukraine but also against NATO bases. In other words, he's suggesting immediately striking NATO bases with tactical nuclear weapons. But you know what's interesting? The uproar is so intense whenever the topic of Tomahawks comes up on Russian talk shows. It's as if demons are crawling out of the guests, like some kind of aliens emerging from them, screeching in ultrasound, ready to destroy the whole world in nuclear dust. However, if before they used to look down from their imperial bell tower, planning to kill everyone and turn the whole world into nuclear ash, now they've split into two camps. The first group still wants to turn the whole world into nuclear ash, while the second is afraid and says that we'll be wiped out even faster. You see, we wanted to capture Ukraine quickly, but it didn't work out. What if we get wiped out even faster? Those who are afraid and say we'll be destroyed faster are, as a rule, military experts or weapons specialists. So most likely they know what they're talking about. So what's causing all this hysteria? Well, Tomahawks and Tomahawks, oh please. And the answer lies precisely in what Dmitry Medvedev wrote. It's been said 100 times, in terms even a star-spangled uncle could understand, that it's impossible to distinguish a nuclear Tomahawk from a conventional one in flight. So if they're launched, it will be the US doing it, meaning read Trump. How should Russia respond? Exactly. So in other words, he's personally threatening Donald Trump. But as you know yourself, Medvedev's threats for some reason aren't very scary. So Medvedev is like this kind of doctor, evil, but from AliExpress. I mean, it seems to me that in Russia they picked a designated threatener, specifically Medvedev for this role, so that, well, there's a threat, but it's not really all that frightening. You know, like a weekend mini Führer, a sample dictator, so they can always let him out of his dollhouse and say, go on, go threaten someone. But it's worth clarifying here that the US no longer has nuclear Tomahawks. Although they used to, at least officially, they don't anymore. There was a nuclear one. Tomahawks, yes, they really existed, with a yield of up to 200 kilotons and a range of up to 2,500 kilometers. It was a very serious missile, but it was completely decommissioned. They were. The ship-based Tomahawks were removed from service, first put into storage, and then dismantled. All of this decision is documented. So, in other words, the US no longer has nuclear Tomahawks in service, at least according to the official version. But the Russians latched onto this. Although the Kinzhal theoretically can also carry a nuclear warhead, the Russian Kinzhal, which is supersonic. Or the Iskander, the same Russian missile, can also be equipped that way. For example, they handed over Iskanders to Lukashenko, supposedly with nuclear warheads. Iskanders? But in general it's allowed for the Russians, but absolutely not for Ukraine. So what kind of Ukraine is this? A country that even missiles similar to those Russia has can't be given to it. Otherwise, what will it do? Is it going to fire that missile right into a dollhouse with a bear inside? Or maybe something even scarier? Maybe somewhere near the bunker? You see, they're scared, they're terrified, afraid that something really could fly 1,600 kilometers. Let's take this version of the Tomahawk missiles. They're scared, and suddenly, bam, out of nowhere, just like that. By the way, a very good question was recently raised on Russian talk shows. Did Ukraine really destroy all of its nuclear weapons? Or maybe back then the president hid a couple. a few warheads. Well, in general, I think they destroyed everything because at that time, everything was saturated with Russian agents. But who really knows? Who knows? In other words, it's a real hysteria. And speaking of hysteria, someone else in Moscow is having one too, runaway Bashar Assad. He's got serious problems. The new leader of Syria is going to Putin to demand Assad's extradition. President of Syria, Ahmed Shara, intends to visit Moscow on Wednesday, today. And the president of Syria plans to discuss two key issues. The first is the extradition of the former Syrian leader Assad, who settled there somewhere in Moscow City, bought himself 20 apartments, and also has a house somewhere in the Moscow suburbs. And the second issue is the continued presence of Russian troops at the bases in Tartus and Khmeimim. So, you see, it's either or. In other words, hide in the wheat, Assad. Putin has a whole reserve of dictators near Moscow, Yanukovych. Assad for the future, Lukashenko. But it seems like Assad will be offered in exchange for the continued presence of Russian troops at the bases in Syria. I doubt anyone will actually make that trade. A living Assad carries a huge amount of shared secrets with Putin. Secrets. Maybe there will be a compromise option, I don't rule it out. This is purely, it'll be an FSB KGB style story where Assad, literally on the eve or a bit later, will accidentally trip on the stairs and fall onto a knife. About 20 times or so. So, just such a ridiculous, such an absurd accident. That's why I think now is the perfect time for Assad to get ready to head west, somewhere, maybe to the US, to Europe, where he could get protection. Well, I don't think anyone will actually let him leave. I think he's being guarded very, very well. By the way, it's the FSB that's guarding him. So for Putin, if Assad starts talking to Western intelligence agencies about chemical weapons, about Russian PMCs in Syria, about Russian troops and what they were doing there and so on, well, that would be unfortunate. You know what's interesting? If something happens, where would Putin himself run to? What do you think? Write your version in the comments. Meanwhile, as Ukraine heroically, first of all, holds back Russian troops and secondly, puts up a worthy resistance, I want to remind you that we are still raising funds for the 101st Brigade for ground evacuation vehicles for the wounded. These are Termit unmanned complexes that allow you to evacuate a soldier to a distance where medics can already start working with him and saving his life. These vehicles are very much needed at the front, so I ask you, let's help our soldiers, let's help finish this fundraiser. There's just a little bit left to go. And as usual, I'll show you a video recorded by the soldiers of the 101st Brigade. They addressed us directly. I believe we will help them.
Ми, бійці 101-ї бригади охорони, звертаємось до Бориса Тізенгаузена та його підписникам за допомогою. Ми дуже вдячні вам за раніше надані дрони. На сьогодні нам дуже потрібні 2 наземні роботизовані комплекси «Терміт» для швидкої і своєчасної евакуації поранених з поля бою, що у теперішній ситуації дозволить врятувати їх життя. Наші підрозділи воюють на Константинівському напрямку та Часовому Ярі. Продовжуємо нищити ворога і віримо в вашу допомогу. Слава Україні!
In this case, it can be said directly that your donation saves the lives of our defenders and helps Ukraine. For this, as always, I want to say a huge thank you. A huge thank you from me and from our soldiers. You are simply an incredible force. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. There is Mono, there is Privat, and there is PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. I see everyone, and I want to say a big, big thank you to each of you individually. Thank you. But if you don't see the link, maybe on another channel, look, here is a QR code. It leads to the fundraiser. So let's help. There's just a little bit left to go. Unknown drones attacked the Russian oil refinery in Ufa. In short, the Bashneft oil refinery was hit. This isn't the first time it's been targeted. It's located 1,400 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, and recently, even 2,000 kilometers away, Russian oil refineries have been struck. This is no longer a problem for Ukrainian drones. This is already the 4th attack on facilities in Bashkortostan in the past month. In other words, these are long-range deep strike attacks, and they're becoming more painful. The Russians now have to somehow find ways to cover a much larger area. By the way, this is also one of the reasons, the range of Tomahawk missiles is one of the reasons why Russians freak out so much when they hear that word. Because a Tomahawk with a warhead of about half a ton means instant destruction. Half of an oil refinery, for example, at the very least the key installations there. But this isn't like drones that fly for a long time before finally arriving, and whose warheads are 10 times smaller, or even 20 times smaller. That same night, another oil refinery was attacked. The Lukoil Volgograd oil refinery also encountered Ukrainian drones. Oil refining, in other words, it's one of the largest in the southern federal district. Its capacity is nearly 15 million tons. So it turns out that the bold gorgon, they're very actively chopping off these snakeheads in the form of oil refineries. And with each of these painful strikes, one more tap that feeds Putin's military budget is being shut off. And that's wonderful. By the way, friends, just recently something very pleasant happened to me. Well, yesterday marked 3 years since the founding of the legendary 3rd Assault Brigade. Well, just the other day I had a meeting with them and they gave me this. This is a token of appreciation for us, for you and me, for our ongoing support of the armed forces of Ukraine. And specifically for the 3rd Assault Brigade, but not only them, for the work we do, for helping collect aid for many units of our armed forces. It's nice, and together you and I we are a megaforce together. Russian regions have started planning tax increases to patch up holes in their budgets. One wants to ask what happened. How is it that in the regions already 7 regions are preparing to raise taxes and cut benefits? And looking at the numbers, by the end of September, the regional budgets were executed with a deficit of as much as over 700 billion rubles. Last year, there was a surplus of almost 500 billion. So can you imagine how great everything is, as Putin says, and how the sanctions are making Russia stronger? So now they're going to start at the local budget level as well. And the benefits? Yeah, what benefits are there? Come on, please. Everything is being thrown into the furnace of war. Everything. And as usual. Plus, they've also announced new tax increases not only in the regions, but across the whole country. All over Russia. The first to react in Russia were the IT specialists. It's strange that they're even still there at all. So Russian IT companies might start going bankrupt en masse and leaving the market after this planned tax hike in Russia. They did the math, and it turns out that for IT companies, the tax burden will increase, attention, by 6 times. So they used to pay 5% of their revenue, and now they'll have to pay up to 30%. Wow, look at that. Putin really outplayed everyone. But that's not all yet. By the way, the government of the Russian Federation about this whole thing with IT specialists leaving, they even reported it to Putin himself, but he doesn't care at all. He doesn't even use the internet. I don't know. And by the way, why doesn't he use the internet? Does he think someone will infect him through the screen or something? And with a mobile phone too. Has anyone ever seen Putin with a mobile phone? No, all he has is, hello, special communications and so on. He's afraid of technology. He's a classic grumpy, paranoid, spiteful old man, who, knowing full well that he doesn't have long left, still won't let others live their lives. So the mystery is, why doesn't Putin use the internet? Maybe he just doesn't want to read what's written out there on the internet. They do it the old-fashioned way. An aide or some old lady brings him a folder. She brings him a folder where everything is printed in huge font like this. Everything's fine, Putin, you're the fairest of them all, the most rosy-cheeked and pale-skinned. You, Putin, you are wonderful, no doubt about it. Your beautiful eyebrows, which you tint with brown mascara. Leningrad, beautiful. No, there is no ruler more handsome or better than you. That's what's written in that folder. I think that's why he doesn't want to hear unpleasant news. He has encountered them, he avoids them. That is, the government has already warned Putin about the threat of financial collapse. More than 50 coal companies. Miners, yes, everyone will be told goodbye. The number of coal industry enterprises that are in the red risk zone has increased to 53. In April there were only 30, now there are 53. The loss of export markets, let me remind you, is due to sanctions, the drop in coal prices, problems with foreign currency settlements, and the unpreparedness of the railways. They were not ready to transport such volumes of raw materials from China. All of this has triggered the most severe crisis since the 1990s. In the coal industry, and let me remind you, in Russia, the coal industry employs 150,000 people. Well, and let's put it this way, what else? Where is a miner supposed to go to work? He'll probably go to war. Maybe that's what this is all for. So let's kill the coal industry and then we'll have 150,000 more. More miners will go. They're used to having good salaries. Although now, honestly, I don't know if miners in Russia have good salaries or not. But in general, we'll put them in a situation where war is the only option, which will help them make ends meet. What do you think of that move? Well, of course, I don't think any of this was actually planned that way, but just imagine, in Russia, as it turns out, when I was studying this topic, there are more than 30 single industry towns, specifically mining towns. You know, a mining town, there's a mine and everything is built around it. All the infrastructure, residential buildings, shops, and so on and so on. So if we're talking about 150,000 miners, then the total population of these 30 single industry towns is 1 million people. Wives, children, families, those who work in these towns, postal workers, shop employees, and so on. So if the mine dies, the single industry town dies too. In other words, for Putin, throwing 1 million people out on the street is no problem at all. Let me remind you, he has already destroyed 1 million people in this war. With those killed and wounded, there are already more than 1 million Russians. So, to put it bluntly, the news is, as they say in a famous computer game, the treasury is empty, my lord. But in a computer game, when the treasury is empty, the peasants just leave the castle, the soldiers desert the army. But here the situation is different. In other words, they'll squeeze every last drop out of Russians, raising whatever they can, taxes, and at the same time they'll ramp up the propaganda pressure. In the West, Russian propaganda is also called fire hose propaganda. That is, it's propaganda that comes at you with such force that it's simply impossible to stop it, with anything. In other words, they'll squeeze every last drop out of Russians. They'll claim that the Ukro-Nazis, Satanists, and gays from the West will come and take everything from Russians, even though by that time they won't have anything left anyway. So Russians, let's tighten our belts even more and give up our last possessions. For the war. Of course, Russians themselves won't give it up voluntarily. They don't even want to fight for Putin for free, but they'll be forced to do so through tax hikes. But if you think that Russians will take to the streets and say, enough, what is this for? Our brothers, fathers, and sons are dying abroad, but no, they won't take to the streets. Putin can't just pull out of this war now either, you see, because then the unspoken question would hang in the air. What was all this for? What was the point of starting it all? Was it all for this scorched patch of Ukrainian land? The Anglo-Saxons and Ukro-Saxons weren't defeated. NATO has approached the borders from the north. Kiev wasn't taken in 3 days nor in 300 days. Not a single regional center has been captured by the Russians since the full-scale invasion. Kherson was temporarily occupied, but the Ukrainian armed forces kicked them out of there with some tough blows. So what was all this for? For a barely functioning Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which the Russians could build as many of as they want back home. You know what else is ironic about what's happening right now? It's that besides paying for the war, people in Russia will also end up paying for weapons for Ukraine. Britain and Canada have decided to add more than 50 billion. According to the European Union's plan to use Russian reserves to help Ukraine. In other words, Kyiv could receive an additional more than 50 billion thanks to Western countries using the frozen reserves of the Bank of Russia. The United Kingdom and Canada are joining this EU initiative, which is now finalizing a plan to transfer a total of 140 billion euros to help Ukraine. This was reported by Bloomberg. So what they're saying is, look, these are Russian frozen assets. This is how many billions per year. We freeze them for a certain number of years so that Ukraine receives 140 billion from the interest, not from the assets themselves. No one is transferring the assets themselves yet. Once these assets have served their purpose and 140 billion have been paid out to Ukraine, then we'll talk. But for now, we'll finance it ourselves so we don't have to wait every year. We'll provide this amount up front and then we'll recoup it from the interest. That's the logic. In general, with the funds received, Kyiv will be able to purchase weapons, including from the US. But they intend to make their own military-industrial complex the main source of weapons supplies from EU countries. A very sound decision. Russian frozen assets will also be used to fund, among other things, the development of the European military-industrial complex, the transfer of weapons to Ukraine, and the purchase of weapons for Ukraine. These are the Russian assets that have been frozen. By the way, doesn't any Russian want to ask Putin how it happened that right after the invasion of Ukraine, it turned out that 300 billion in Russian assets were sitting right there on that in the hated West, which they so fiercely despise. 300 billion. By the way, this is actually proof that Putin did not plan for a long war. In other words, he planned to deal with Ukraine in a matter of days, so quickly that the West wouldn't even have time to react. We remember those first weeks, the chaos when people were saying Ukraine would last just a couple of weeks and that would be it. And even more so, no one would have touched Russian money. But since Ukraine held out and gave the Russians such a beating, pardon my French, and this war unfortunately has now been going on for a fourth year, Putin is now just stuck, that's all. His summer-autumn offensive failed. He can't do anything. Right now at the front, and just as Ukraine managed to stop this orcish horde, now, as they say, it's fair game to hold on to those assets. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel after all. There was this boy from Russia who loved Putin, but he accidentally subscribed, just clicked by mistake and subscribed, and in the morning he realized, he woke up and understood that Russia isn't great, it's just big in reality. Because truly great nations don't attack those they consider weaker than themselves. And especially, they don't get beaten back like that. So subscribe, friends. And with all due respect to NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, I recently came across some news that really ticked me off. Well, that is if you can even say that about me with my mild schizoid tendencies. I mean, as for Mark Rutte's statements, he usually speaks quite clearly, pretty tough, but this time just listen. Regarding whether or not Russian planes that violate the airspace of other countries should be shot down. If we had shot down Russian planes over NATO airspace, we would have appeared weak, said Secretary General Mark Rutte. As long as they don't pose a threat, we will gently escort them out of our airspace. That's a proportional response. We are significantly stronger than Russia. Well then, if you follow that logic, Erdogan must be some kind of weakling. So according to this, the one who literally shot down a Russian plane in the very first minute after it violated the airspace is a weakling? Pain, and that's it. After that, did a single Russian plane even dare to violate their airspace again? No.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
So that logic isn't quite right. It reminds me of childhood, when adults tried to give kids some supposedly wise advice. Like when a kid gets hit by another kid, a mean kid, let's say, and people tell him, you should be smarter than him, just be smarter, don't hit back. But sometimes you shouldn't be smarter, you should just hit him back and maybe then he'll stop. He'll start to realize, oh, I can get hit in return, maybe I shouldn't go around hitting everyone. Because if everyone just keeps saying, be smarter, that bully just keeps going around hitting everyone. That's not right, you have to stop it right away. Just give him a smack, that's it. You don't need to be smarter, you need to be tougher, especially with people like that, like Putin, people who are out of their minds. I've said it many times before, the inability to strike back when that's exactly what's expected of you always means encouraging the aggressor. In this case, it just spurs Putin on to keep going. So we're stronger, but we'll just gently escort them out. No. In the previous program, I talked about how in 2013, the inability to strike when it was expected of you, the indecisiveness of Barack Obama. At that time, a strike needed to be carried out against Assad, who was targeted for using chemical weapons. And that's when Obama said, no, I'm not ready, let Congress decide. And the whole world was waiting, like, of course, now the states will strike, now they'll calm down this madman who's using chemical weapons. And that's when they would have calmed him down. The inability to strike, 2013, Putin immediately thought, wow, so the US isn't what it used to be, they won't strike, not even at me. Great, a few months later, the annexation of Crimea, the occupation of Donbas, the deployment of troops to Syria. That's what it means to fail to strike even once. By the way, I think that if some brave Swedish pilot were to go and take action, by the way, today there's an important NATO meeting, and the Swedish Minister of Defense said, we will defend ourselves immediately if anyone violates our airspace. So, if some Swedish, Finnish or Turkish pilot pulls the trigger or fires a missile, even if it doesn't hit, even if the Russians shoot it down with some countermeasures, I don't know, something else, believe me, there won't be any war. The ball jellyfish will just wet itself 3 times over at most. Then he'll buy up all the suitcases around the Kremlin and think, turns out they're actually decisive. No wonder. They call themselves the coalition of the decisive. And one more thing, Mark Rutte also added that if the plane doesn't pose a threat, we'll gently escort it. Oh, excuse me. So how is it that combat aircraft from the aggressor country, which are right now fighting and killing from those planes, how does that work? They don't pose a threat in NATO airspace? So, a threat is only when they've already launched a missile? Only then is it a threat? By then it might be too late. And now Belgium has confirmed that NATO is currently discussing simplifying the process of shooting down drones and aircraft of the Russian Federation. So there are countries, like Belgium for example, that are fully integrated into the NATO system. That means they don't have their own internal rules for their pilots. They might not have any pilots there at all. That's why this mechanism needs to be discussed within NATO, simplifying the process of shooting down drones and aircraft. But the fact that they've started discussing it is already a good sign. And now our segment, the withered emperor outsmarted everyone again. So, the European Union today presented a plan to prepare for war with Russia by 2030. Bloomberg reports this. The document which Bloomberg reviewed provides for a large-scale update of military planning and procurement. In general, according to this plan, by the end of 2027, the European Union should conduct 40% of its arms purchases jointly. That's more than double the current level. Compared to the current level, and it's expected that these efforts will begin as early as next year. And if Europe wants to be ready for war in 2030, the plan will be presented on Thursday and finalized next week at the summit in Brussels. So it feels like by 2030 Russia won't just be fighting, a half of Russia will already be speaking Chinese. At the rate Putin is ruling, that's where things are headed. But everything depends on many factors. Ukraine traditionally says thank you to everyone who helps us. And you can see how everything is shifting a little bit. So maybe many have realized that the paper tiger, or rather the paper rat, is not that strong. Yes, there are threats, some hybrid attacks, all of that. But you can take revenge for all of this right now. For all those arson attacks at post offices. For all those drones flying into your territory, you know how? Give Ukraine long-range weapons. And then there won't be any factories making those drones that could reach you. That's the best way, the best investment. So, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, subscribe to this channel, and let's support the fundraiser. It's for the 101st Brigade, for ground evacuation vehicles for wounded soldiers, and for drones as well. Let me remind you, the donation details are in the description of this video. Wishing us all a peaceful day, and glory to Ukraine.